Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk a little bit about the possible explanations of how these roommates did not hear this extremely violent crime happening in their house. Now we know that Dylan and Bethany were inside during the time of the crimes. But what about the other two roommates? Now, law enforcement believes that whoever committed this crime began on the third level, which is where Kaylee and Maddie were at. So, when these crimes were being carried out, it wouldn't have just been Dylan and Bethany who would have been able to hear what was happening on the top level. It would have also been Xana and Ethan. So that would be 4 people on the lower levels below the third level that seemingly did not hear the violent, brutal acts that were happening upstairs, right above their heads. So how did these roommates not distinguish what they were hearing? Is it possible that the roommates were having a little after party? Maybe there were people inside the house and there was a lot of noise when these crimes were occurring. Now, we don't know what happened between 2 and 4 a.m. And if we really want to break it down, we don't really know what was happening inside that house from 2 a.m. until noon when law enforcement showed up. We have no idea what was going on all night inside the King Roadhouse. Now, there were 6 people inside this house, according to law enforcement, and only 2 were left alive to tell the story. We have no idea what Bethany and Dylan told law enforcement. So we have pieces and parts of their statements, but I'm sure that all of the important details have been left out. So it's very possible that they did tell investigators that they were having a party that night. It's very possible that maybe a fight broke out. Was there one hell of a battle going on down there? Maybe the fight that began at the fraternity house carried over to the King Roadhouse. Or it's very possible that it was a whole different fight altogether. I've always thought that it was kind of odd that these 6 roommates, or 5 roommates and Ethan, all kind of split up and went their separate ways. You had Maddie and Kaylee who went downtown. You had Ethan and Xana who allegedly went to the Sigma Chi party. Bethany also apparently was at that same Sigma Chi party, but it doesn't sound as though she was with Ethan and Xana. And then Dylan was also out that night. It was described that, at first it was described that Dylan and Bethany were out in the community. And then Bethany kind of ended up being at the Sigma Chi party. But that's another story. So they all kind of split up, and then they all returned back to the King Roadhouse at approximately the same time, according to law enforcement. It just seems strange to me that nothing was happening at the King Roadhouse. This was known as a party house. So it seems odd that all of the roommates returned home at approximately the same time, and there was no party going on. There were people partying all around this house. We saw in the Banfield footage that there were students walking all around this area. So I've just never understood why these 6 individuals returned home and just quietly got ready to go to bed. It seems as though there would be something going on at that house. And maybe there was. Maybe there was something going on at that house, and maybe a fight broke out. It's very possible that that fight got out of control. But because of the commotion, maybe Dylan and Bethany and the other two roommates didn't realize the severity of the violence that was happening inside this house. The problem that I would have with that explanation is that would mean that there were more witnesses. That would mean that there would be a number of witnesses, the people who were inside this house. And I feel like law enforcement would have been able to question those witnesses and narrow it down to a suspect. So basically, if there were more people inside the King Road house, that would create the potential for a lot more witnesses. Another sticking point for me is that this happened on two levels. One of those levels was the main level. So how did these crimes happen over two levels, the third level and the main level, and nobody saw or heard anything? That just doesn't make sense to me. If these crimes were contained to, say, just the top level, if these crimes just occurred on the third level, that might be a little more understandable, because then it would have been contained at the very top level of the house. But the fact that these crimes happened basically all over the house would lead me to believe that there would have been a number of witnesses, and the chances of hearing these brutal crimes taking place would be a lot better. It seems as though because of the where the bedrooms were at in the house, it seems as though it would be difficult not to hear these crimes. As I said, law enforcement believes that these crimes began on the top level. So that means that it wouldn't just be Dylan and Bethany who would be hearing what was happening to Kaylee and Maddie. It would have also been Ethan and Xana. None of these people moved. They all stayed in place. Nobody ran from the house, and nobody called 911. So why didn't these four roommates hear what was happening upstairs? I believe that everyone in this house heard the commotion. And I believe that these sounds would be very distinct. These victims' lives were taken with a knife. So I would imagine that there would be screaming, very distinct sounds that would indicate to these four roommates what was happening upstairs. If you didn't think that your roommates were upstairs losing their lives, then you would definitely think that something bad was happening. I read an interview with a former student at the University of Idaho, and he actually rented Bethany's bedroom before she lived there. And he stated in this interview that he could rarely hear noise on the second and third levels of the King Road house, just because of how Bethany's bedroom was located on the first level and the way that the house was laid out. So in my opinion, Bethany would have heard it the least. That's just my opinion. But Dylan, I just can't imagine that Dylan is on the same exact floor with two of the victims, and then directly under two of the victims from the third floor, and she doesn't hear people fighting for their lives. It's kind of unbelievable. She was right in the mix. She was right in the middle of where everything was happening. So basically, these victims were losing their lives all around her. Is there a chance that Dylan knew that there was fighting going on in the house and she just didn't understand the extent of the brutality that was happening to her roommates? And that's why she didn't call 911. It's a possibility, but I just feel like the sounds would have been very distinct. I feel like it wouldn't have been that difficult to distinguish between some boys fighting and people brutally losing their lives to someone with a knife. I mean, this is 4 victims whose lives were all taken with a knife on 2 separate levels. I feel like the sounds would be undeniable. I feel like it would be very difficult not to hear these victims fighting for their lives. I do think that it's very possible that there was a fight inside this house, but I don't feel like those sounds would be confused. I don't feel like the sound of people fighting would be confused with 4 victims losing their lives to someone with a knife. So I feel as though even if Dylan didn't realize that her roommates were being stabbed, it seems as though she would realize that something very bad was happening and that she should call for help. Why Dylan never called for help or never called 911 is still a mystery. Now, another possibility of why Dylan and Bethany may not have heard exactly what was going on inside of the house is because, is it possible that maybe they weren't even there at the time that these crimes occurred? Is it possible that maybe a fight did break out and that maybe they left because they didn't want to be a part of it? That would make sense as to why they didn't hear or know what was happening during the time of the crimes. I've thought about this in the past because to me that seems like that would be the explanation that would make sense, that they weren't home when it all happened. And it seems as though that would have been an easy explanation for them to tell law enforcement. You know, we weren't there. We didn't hear what was happening. Maybe it's possible that this fight broke out and they left the house because they didn't want to be a part of it. And then maybe came home later on that morning and found their roommates. But then, of course, that would negate Dylan seeing the intruder at approximately 4 a.m. Because if Dylan and Bethany weren't at the house, then Dylan obviously wouldn't have been there to see the intruder. But to me, that would be the most common sense explanation, would be that these roommates were not there. As I said, we don't know what was happening inside the King Roadhouse between 2 a.m. and noon when law enforcement arrived. So the exhibit to the PCA says that Dylan and Bethany returned home at approximately 1 a.m. But it never says whether maybe they left again or not. Maybe they did return home at around 1 a.m. But maybe they didn't stay home. Or maybe one of them stayed home and the other one left. It's very possible that maybe Bethany came home around 1 a.m. and then left again. And Dylan was left on the second level where she saw the intruder at approximately 4 a.m. So we don't really know exactly what happened during this time, because this is Dylan and Bethany's recollection of what happened that night. Because if there really was only 6 people inside the King Roadhouse when these crimes occurred, then Dylan and Bethany would basically control the narrative. It would seem odd for Dylan and Bethany to say that they were inside the house at the time of the crimes if they weren't. Because, like I said, that seems like that would be an easier explanation. If Bethany and Dylan were not inside the house, that would completely explain the 8-hour delay to call 911 and why they didn't find these victims until almost noon. But that's not what they stated to law enforcement. Law enforcement stated that they were both inside the house at the time of the crimes. We've also heard that when Dylan heard the commotion going on inside the house, that she believed that it could possibly just be friends or guests of the house. And when she saw the individual walk past her bedroom door, that she didn't go into shock at all, because she believed that it was a guest leaving the house. Now, the problem with that is that law enforcement stated that the data between Dylan and Bethany's cellular phones is what helped them construct this timeline. So basically, Dylan and Bethany were communicating with each other. But is it possible that maybe they weren't just communicating with each other, but also messaging the other roommates to see if they were okay? Because they did hear the commotion that was going on upstairs. Because why else would law enforcement use that communication to put together the timeline of when these crimes were taking place, unless Dylan and Bethany were talking about these crimes? So that wouldn't really make sense, that Dylan thought that this was just a friend leaving the house. Maybe Dylan and Bethany were talking about fleeing the house, and maybe that's exactly what they did. But it just seems as though, since law enforcement used the cellular phone data between Dylan and Bethany to help them put together the timeline, that this communication would have been about these crimes. I mean, how else would we know what time that these crimes occurred unless it was talked about in this communication between Dylan and Bethany? And maybe this is also the time when the roommates weren't responding, because it's very possible that Dylan and Bethany were also messaging the other roommates to see if they were okay, because they were hearing these sounds. Now, another possibility, and I know that people don't necessarily like to talk about this aspect, but it's also very possible that these roommates were under the influence of substances. We'll say Molly, something that's a step above MJ and alcohol, but something that might affect their judgment and their perception. It's very common among college kids all over the country, not just at the University of Idaho. It's not uncommon at all for college students to get together as a group, either at a house or an apartment, and use these particular substances. This might explain why the people in this house had a lack of judgment, because maybe they had an altered sense of reality. Maybe their perception was off. It's very possible that there were other people inside this house that were also using these types of substances. We know that we saw at least 4 individuals running from the direction of the King Roadhouse toward the frat houses. In the Banfield body cam footage, you see them running past the light. So it's very possible that this was a group that got together at the King Roadhouse in order to use these substances. There's a lot of reactions to these, to these certain substances. One of them is an altered perception of reality. People may dismiss things that they see or things that they hear because they know that they're under the influence of this narcotic. So it's very possible that maybe these roommates, some of the roommates, maybe all of the roommates, were under the influence. The word Molly has come up quite a bit around, these statements from these students from the University of Idaho. It's not just the University of Idaho. It's a very popular substance on college campuses across the country. So it wouldn't seem all that unbelievable that these students, these victims, and these roommates may have been under the influence. Now, I'm not saying that they were addicts or anything like that, but it's very possible that they were using these substances recreationally. There were probably a lot of illegal substances around this area. This neighborhood was filled with college students. And I think we all know that it's not uncommon for college students to experiment with these types of illegal substances. I feel like there would probably be a lot of these illegal substances floating around the King Roadhouse. Now, I wonder if any of these substances were found around any of the victims, because we don't know what investigators found when they went into the house. I feel like this could be a possible explanation, because if these roommates had just been drinking, I still feel as though they would be able to distinguish the noises that they were hearing. I do believe that this was loud. But if they were under the influence of mind-altering substances, that might explain why they weren't believing what they were hearing. I think it would have had to be something more than just being drunk. This was a very violent quadruple homicide committed with a knife. In my opinion, I believe that everyone in this house heard what was happening. And even if they weren't able to distinguish that their roommates' lives were being taken with a sharp-edged blade, I do believe that they still would have understood that something extremely bad was happening that would warrant a 911 call. I feel like the noise that they would have been hearing would have registered in their brain that they needed to call for help. So, in my opinion, the only way that these roommates do not hear what is going on in the house or don't distinguish it as their roommates' lives being taken is one, either they had a lot of people at the house and didn't understand what was happening, didn't realize what was happening because of the commotion inside the house. There's also the possibility that a big fight broke out and Dylan and Bethany took off. They didn't want to be a part of it. So there is the possibility that maybe Dylan and Bethany were not inside the house as these crimes were occurring. Or there's the possibility that these roommates were under the influence of illegal substances, and they didn't put two and two together about what they were hearing. Because those are the only reasons that I can think of that these roommates would not hear what's happening inside this house. And I'm not just talking about Dylan and Bethany. I'm also talking about Ethan and Xana. If these crimes did, in fact, begin on the third level, as law enforcement believes that they did. Even if these crimes happened on the second level, then Dylan and Bethany, it seems, would have heard exactly what was happening to Ethan and Xana, and so would Maddie and Kaylee. So however you look at it, it seems as though there would be 4 roommates who were hearing what was happening while these crimes were occurring. But why didn't anybody call for help? Why didn't anybody run from the house? It just doesn't make sense. I have an explanation that I think could possibly explain why none of these people called 911 or flee the house. And we're going to talk about that in my next video. Because as you put the pieces together, the way that it's described by law enforcement just doesn't make sense. It actually defies common sense. How do you have these people in the house who are hearing this brutal crime, but none of them call 911? None of them run from the house. They all just stayed in place. Nobody moved. How do you have a hell of a battle going on inside this house, but then all of these victims are just found in their beds? There's just so many things that don't make sense, and they just don't add up. And I know that we only have pieces and parts of this story. But one piece of this story that will never make sense to me is how these roommates did not hear their friends, their friends' lives being brutally taken while they were all under the same roof. That'll just never make sense to me. It just seems odd that these roommates would not hear the violence that was occurring inside this house, unless there was either a crowd of people that maybe would have caused some confusion. Maybe, they weren't in their right frame of mind. Or maybe they left and they weren't even there. But then that would contradict the PCA. So, in my opinion, we still don't have an explanation as to how these roommates did not hear what was happening inside the King Roadhouse. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.